Hi, my name is Ariana Young, and I am going to begin my synthesis for week 7. So, there were several themes that I saw across the text. The first theme that I want to kind of lead you guys through, the way I set it up, is sort of like a narration of the different steps that leads us to like a final conclusion. The first one is the concept of individual power versus collective power. There was a lot of discussion about the intersection of identity, the intersection of individual strength and acknowledgement versus collective strength and acknowledgement. There was often blind spots that we saw in people's understanding. So leading that us into the tension between the collective and the individual. So I think that Fitzpatrick did an amazing job of really explaining how collective power is used to hold certain people in a position. She said that whiteness is constructed around individuals while employing broad generalizations for people of color. The blame shifts to individual white bad actors instead of the institutional racism. But that same consideration is not given to people of color. We are not seen as individuals, we are seen as a collective. Um, White individuals and educators are seen as unique and not a reflection of the total racial group, but minorities are often seen as a representative of everyone, and we have to answer for the actions of one person for everyone. Um, One of the things that I noticed a lot in this reading and in synthesizing is that we asked a lot of questions. And actually, I think that's really great because part of learning is asking questions and understanding how we feel about different ideas and thoughts. So Fletcher asked some really amazing questions around this topic. He asked, why can't a black student receive the same education as a white student? And that's totally legitimate because we can see, factually, why not, right? And why are we still experiencing oppression? And I think we know the answers to some of these things, but yet the question, when it's stated so bluntly, it almost seems hyperbolic, but it's actually like factual, and it's sometimes shocking when you really consider that. Maybe shocking is not the right word, but it's disturbing. Um, and what do you need to do to advocate for a dramatic change? And I think that's really important because this isn't going to happen organically. It has to be something that intentionally occurs over time. And these conversations need to happen not just in the school building, but also through relationships with families and in the home. Because if it's not occurring in the home as well, then it's going to be kind of left. So it's in the school, it's through relationships, and then it's also at home. So, having discussed those structural barriers that we asked, like, why are they still in place? Like, we need to talk about what they are and how they affect our lives. One of the things that several teachers mentioned was unknown and hidden bias. So, in my school environment, we talk a lot about implicit bias, but it does seem that there's a general understanding that a lot of teachers are completely unaware. And actually, as frustrating as that might be, I do find that maybe encouraging because if it's unaware, then that means that if it's brought to the attention of people, then perhaps they will change the way they react or teach or respond. So, um, there are many hidden biases observable in many facets of education, and this is from the top down in every demographic. There is a bias that we have. And we need to take a step back and sort of reflect on ourselves and analyze that. A topic that I really feel was a dominant theme was professional development. A lot of the texts that we read this week were about teachers and their reactions to students and how we can change those teachers and educators' trajectory to something else. That's a question that I think is legitimate that we really need to ask and evaluate. So we asked, they often said that trainings, they talk about culture and poverty and diversity, and those are like feel good things, but like it needs to be deeper. they have to specifically address whiteness and specifically address how that impacts students of colors. We need to engage in discussion about teaching and learning practices, structures, and policies that support racial power inequities. We have to be specific and direct. This is not going to be something talking about, oh, kumbaya, we're all going to get along. It has to be like explicit. So then that leads us to our next point, dialogue. Dialogue is key. Several of my colleagues talked about how dialogue is needed for transformation. And, I want to go a step further and say, like, dialogue, honestly, in a safe place is needed for transformation, because we need to create a space where people are allowed to ask questions, even if those questions are rooted in that structural inequity, because that is something that they have been taught their entire life, something that I have been taught most of my life. And they need to have the space to question those things and to be able to ask them and challenge those ideas. Because without that space, we really can't move forward and make real growth. We have to have time to not just look at data, but to unpack our emotional reactions to that data, what that says about our students. When we don't explicitly talk about the narrative about why that's occurring, we're then left to come up with our own ideas why. And that is when it becomes problematic, because those ideas are not rooted in truth, they're rooted often in stereotypes and our implicit bias. So again, this group liked to ask a lot of rhetorical questions. It's like, do we have self-awareness? And how can we be taught tolerance, if we're not told the truth about our history? How do we talk about how the structures, they shaped all of us, of every background. All of us are shaped by the racist structural system, so we all need to reflect on it. And how do we use that knowledge to empower our students? And this leads us into our final point, which is curriculum. So with that knowledge that we now have, understanding the structures that exist, understanding the power the collective has versus the individual, and how we need to create equity in that space, how do we now create a curriculum when we're teaching our students that allows them to feel empowered? And the first step really is addressing the inequity that we already have in curriculum, right? We acknowledge that we have a skewed curriculum. We recognize that there is inherent racism. We recognize that there is inherent bias, gender bias. We recognize that teachers are mandated to teach certain textbooks and teach certain perspectives. And what can we do to contextualize them for students to make them more accessible so they can see themselves reflected in them? Which brings me to my personal favorite quote of the reading for this past week. Ideally, the curriculum provides each student with both windows out to the experiences of others and mirrors of her own reality and validity. But for most students, the present curriculum provides many windows and few mirrors. And the question really is, how can I make sure that all my students are provided both windows and mirrors in curriculum, showing a diverse and lived experience? How can we create an equitable playing field? How do we change the way we teach, change the way that a student views themselves in the world and their position in it, and how they can change it? So I really feel that our educational experience allows us to see the world through the lens of a man who existed in a world that he owned, and that man could be any metaphorical man you want to put in that place. And unfortunately, our students don't see themselves in literature. They don't see themselves in our curriculum, and teachers are silent about it. They don't explain why that is, and that leaves us to make our own conclusions. And we are specifically given a few windows that are carefully curated for us to look out of, to study the world, but they're not made for us to really change the world. And I think that's the next step we need to take. We need to empower students to see themselves as citizens in a democratic society. We need to empower them to realize that they can be the change that they want to see, and they need to understand through our teaching that they have the words to name the structures that have imprisoned them. And once they have those words to name those things, they can start to change them. And we can promote that type of reflection and independence and interdependence within them. So that is my synthesis for week 7. Thank you so much.